Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the most important mile. And it's about inclusive futures in local deliveries and autonomous vehicles. I'm Benjamin de la Peña, or Benjamin de la Peña. People call me Benjie. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. Shared Use Mobility Center is headquartered in Chicago. We're located on traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. For the sake of the visually impaired participants, let me describe how I appear on screen. I'm a middle-aged Asian man, brown skin, with short black hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing a black sweater and a white collared shirt underneath it. Welcome. Exciting conversation today on scenarios for making local delivery much more inclusive. And it can come at a sooner time. We just went through Cyber Monday. The pandemic grew local deliveries and freight deliveries tremendously. Some of the numbers I'm seeing is something like a 37% increase year on year, bigger in the US as we all turn to ordering. And so there's a lot of activity in this space. Currently, we're in a supply chain. We have problems in the supply chain. And so running up to Christmas, right, or the holidays, more of problems in how we deliver things, but also great growth in a tremendous growth in this area. And at the same time, just this explosion of robotics. And we have a really, really interesting panel today who will present to us. Two of our panelists will present the scenarios, and then we will talk about what that all means. So let me invite my panelists to come on. And let me introduce each of them. So today we have Bryan Boyer. Bryan is the co-founder of the architecture and strategic design studio Dash Marshall. But he also runs, he runs a studio strategic design practice, but he's also the founding director of the urban technology program at the University of Michigan's College of Architecture and Urban Planning. It's the first program, I think, that I've seen that is focused on urban technology, the mix of the soft side of urbanism and the hard side of technology. He was also the co-founder of the Helsinki Design Lab at the Finnish Innovation Fund, one of the first design teams working at the national level. So he's, I first met Bryan about 8 years ago, and we both got talking about institutions and designing institutions and what that meant for change. And I follow his newsletter, Urban Technology, closely, because just all of the insights on what's happening to technology and how we interact with technology, I think is, if you're an urbanist, if you're a technologist, you should subscribe to it. Anthony Townsend, Dr. Anthony Townsend is the urbanist in residence at Cornell Tech's Jacobs Institute. He was the founding team of that urban tech hub, which is located on Roosevelt Island in New York City. He directs applied research and teaches courses on smart cities and engineering. He's the author of 2 books, Ghost Road Beyond the Driverless Car, and Smart Cities, Big Data Civic Hackers, and a Quest for a New Utopia. I first met Anthony about a decade ago, where we're looking at the future of smart cities. He was working on his book. I have a little bit of a walk-on part of his book. And he was looking at all of the innovation, civic innovations that was happening. And so since then, have occasionally worked with him on just the future of mobility and technology and its implications. He has a consulting group, the Star City Group, and he works around the world with industry, government, and philanthropy on urban tech foresight, right, and policy and planning studies. And last but not least, Imogen Pierce joins us as the only reactor on the panel. So we will be turning to her for kind of her proofing these ideas that Anthony and Bryan brings us. Imogen works in sustainable mobility and the future of technology. Currently, she's working for Fully Charged and also doing some work for an ethical AI company called Bubblr. She was, I first met Imogen about a year ago during the pandemic in a virtual convening led by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and World Economic Forum, I think, on zero emission urban fleets. And she was working then with Arrival, where she was head of city engagement and integration, working with cities to understand and develop and accelerate their future mobility options. I was particularly struck by that company's focus on distributed manufacturing of AV and how that was going to interact with the system. And so that really interested in her insights. She she works in experience strategy, looking at the future of technology and automotive trends. Prior to working for Arrival, she was an aerodynamicist at Jaguar Land Rover. Fascinating title. But of course, all of these vehicles have to be aerodynamic, especially if they're reducing drag and maybe reducing carbon. So that's our three people panelists for today. I'd like to thank ahead of time my colleagues Israel Ramirez and Hani Shamat and Hannah Wilson, who isn't here, who was helping us put all of this together, and my colleagues also in the Shared Use Mobility Center. So with that, I'm going to just quickly read a bit of the preface from your report to contextualize it. And the report, which is available on our website, the most important mile, starts with this. The future has arrived in a hurry. Over the last decade, online shopping grew at a brisk pace. Most expected this trend to continue, steadily replacing our shopping centers and high streets with deliveries. Then COVID arrived and everything went fast forward. Stores all over the world closed their doors for months, and changes in delivery that we didn't expect to happen until 2030 or 2040 were suddenly here. And in that context, I'm going to turn it over to Bryan, who will present to us what their scenarios and how they got there.
Thank you, Benjie. Thanks for having us. So the work in the report, started like most of the projects that Anthony and I have done together by paying really close attention to what's happening right now. And so the three articles that are on the screen are pulled actually from the last 6 months, and that's after this project was finished. But the headlines are things that I think have been in the air for quite some time now. So for instance, when Amazon bought Whole Foods, a lot of us speculated that that was really about having a kind of beachhead into neighborhoods across the country. Likewise, free delivery for food from Whole Foods was seen perhaps like many startups as a way to acquire users, but not a permanent process or a permanent promise, sorry, if you will, for free delivery services. And then this question of when you get to such scale as something like Amazon Web Services, for instance, what happens when that stuff starts to break? And so just a few days ago, we saw the Amazon Web Services outage that left a number of different websites essentially broken. And one of the starting points for the most important mile was to ask ourselves, what happens if you're a community that isn't at the top of the list for a giant multinational like Amazon or others who have an outsized role in the current delivery ecosystem? So if you're on the other side of a broken AWS, how long are you waiting for things to get fixed? How long are you waiting for those services to be restored? And so what we were trying to do is look at these emerging trends or changes within industry, and then think about a kind of alternative universe of deliveries that are driven by cooperatives, collectives, co-ops, governments, all operating in a slightly different way than they are today, or perhaps pressing fast forward, as Benjie mentioned, on some of the emerging trends. Anthony, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So I think one of the other things that was on our mind when this work was created, which I think we started working in May of 2020 on it, was really all of the exciting adaptation and the tremendous amount of resilience that we saw in local economies to try to figure out how to maintain relationships with their customers. And for service providers, like with the people that they served, even as quarantines and lockdowns and mandatory closures were happening. And these are really exciting developments, for those of us who think that, we need more locally generated commerce to balance out the tremendous push towards bigger consolidation and more global integration. So things like, and we were sort of picking up signals of this alongside the signals we were seeing about, the growing dominance of some of the big delivery companies and the big e-retailers. Whether it was mutual aid networks putting together community refrigerators and food pantries, which happened all over the world and fed millions of people, to local restaurant groups and chambers of commerce organizing shared delivery services more or less on the fly, to individual entrepreneurs and developers creating new software that was allowing businesses and NGOs to coordinate these kinds of logistics outside of the solutions that industry had provided. And that was really exciting and heartening. And to us, it kind of, I think the urgent need for this was driven by fear that, local economies would suffer, small retailers would suffer, and consumers would suffer ultimately from the power asymmetry that emerged during the pandemic. But it was also this opportunity to start to imagine and design some more kind of holistic, socially, economically sustainable systems. And so that's what we sought out to do. And we developed 3 scenarios. I think the next slide will have, So farm to table and back again, which looks at local cooperatives, really around reorganizing the food system. The makers of Etsy Town, which is about small scale manufacturing in a city, and Postify, which reimagines the role of national postal systems in creating a more inclusive local delivery system in the future. Can we go to the next slide? So I want to set the scene by just reading the introduction to the farm to table and back again. And each of these scenarios has a fictional introduction, a very short vignette, which sets the scene and kind of gives you a first-person view of the future, a more analytical kind of journalistic narrative that plays the scenario out over time on a larger scale, and then a set of building blocks that Bryan will talk about, which are really the things that are happening in the world now that became the props and the set pieces and the characters and the plot elements in these scenarios. So let's go to April 8th, 2031 in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. The mule waited silently as Daniel finished checking in the last of the crates stacked neatly on the curb. The rest of the volunteers eyed the produce, bread, and honey with eager eyes. Let's load the compost bins and send it off, Daniel called to the team. His phone buzzed with orders, which he quickly swiped over to the throng of 20-somethings before him. As the mule trundled away, the trainee sprang into action. The neighborhood was already starting to wake up. 3 of you do the deliveries, Daniel said. The rest set up the stand. Where's little Sonia? He asked. But the 9-year-old was already scooting away, basket in hand, to drop a delivery at the Hussein's flat on her way to school. A minute or 2 later, the team's pockets buzzed in unison. All the deliveries were done, and their shares were already on deposit. That was the best part. Surplus, the dumpster diving club turned supermarket, turned cooperative mega retailer, was theirs. So can we go to the next slide? So really what this does is shows you, how people could live in the future, use technology to carry out the kinds of commerce that is happening today, but to do it in a more socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable framework. Sorry, I have a phone ringing that I need to turn off. I apologize. So Bryan, did you want to go through the building blocks here and share with the group some of the things that we saw in the world today that helped inspire that scenario?
So the farm to table story really started with this signal, as we call it, of Surplus, which is a food chain operating currently in Berlin that collects ugly food and rescues food waste, basically to put it back into the food supply chain, as we're seeing these kind of rescue supermarkets that have happened in a number of places. And we're pairing that with some of emerging platforms that Anthony alluded to For instance, in Denver, there's a group called the Food Rescue Robot, which has basically a routing system for food that is pulled out of waste streams and can be redirected, trying to match food that is unneeded with people who need that food. Also looking at the delivery system. So for instance, the co-op cycle, which is a European network of delivery co-ops that again are powered by folks with bikes, cargo bikes, but are coordinated by a digital system, right? And so we're starting to see local, small co-ops in this case using technologies that look a lot like the kind of coordination platforms that somebody like Uber or Lyft are using. And then when we're thinking about how does this type of thing scale, we're really inspired by, again, the kind of credit unions and co-op approaches that have been used in the past to provide communities the financial resources, not just to meet their needs today, but to think about how you grow into providing for yourselves at a larger scale or investing in the future that you'd like to see. And so that swirl of different signals became the scenario that is the farm to table to back again story.
And so you see that showing up in, I just want to jump in real quick. You see those elements showing up in that brief vignette in some sometimes uncomfortable ways. So for instance, little Sonia, the 9-year-old who's making a delivery on her way to kindergarten, is really a way of thinking about like the gig economy that's very much in play today with DoorDash and those kinds of services that are quite, exploitative of workers, and putting a 9-year-old in the service of that. And it's very uncomfortable. But then you find out that it's a worker-owned cooperative. It's a community-owned cooperative, and it turns that on its head and presents this opportunity that, a 9-year-old could have a stake and have responsibility in a sustainable, circular local food system, and that could be a really good thing. And the technology is there in the background, making that possible without sort of taking over the whole scene.
In the future, children have to work for their allowance.
Yeah.
So we'll just give a quick highlight of the other two stories. And you can see here the kind of similar building blocks. So in a way, the building blocks for us function almost as a cliff notes, right? They're the summary of the story. And the scenario itself is creating some connective tissue to really show how those relate and show how they add up to something larger, how they scale. So the second story is what we call Makers of Etsy Town, and it's imagining a neighborhood, basically Brooklyn, as a urban manufacturing hub that is both powered by local makers and also locally owned delivery networks. And so in this project, we're trying to imagine the ways in which that type of future might emerge in contrast to the kind of status quo path that we're currently on, where there's a heavy private sector ownership of the delivery infrastructure. And in the third story, Postify, this one, we wanted to think about a slightly different scale. And so for the Postify story, we're imagining delivery as a service along the lines of the mobility as a service developments that have been happening in a number of places in recent years, and really thinking about what are the ways that a national postal service, if they made data the primary thing that they own and move, how could that then be used to shape markets to either make it easier for other types of folks to enter the delivery market from an economic standpoint, but also to diversify the amount and the quality of the services, right? So for instance, I don't know about you, but I have a basement full of Amazon boxes that need to be recycled. And so in this story, we're talking about the ways in which setting fair incentives and recognizing the diversity of needs and incentives would allow us then to conceptualize having somebody who might deliver packages, but also take some of the recycling waste away on their way back. and that's not going to necessarily make sense for people who are hyper-focused on just jamming packages at you. But if you are making a different choice about where you're spending your money, and there's an ecosystem of delivery services to support that, that we might see those types of variations emerge.
Could I point out one other thing, Brian, in these cliff notes, is the third column, which is sort of what's the big policy planning question that emerges or that's provoked by that signal in being incorporated into our scenario. And these, range from sort of very precise focus things, around, like, say, open source robotics. There's a lot of AVs that show up in these stories. In the one that I read, we called it a mule. This is essentially like a minivan-sized AV parcel locker that just rolls into a neighborhood, like the kind of things that Neuro and others are making. But we don't really say much about, who made it, who owns it, where it comes from. To much bigger policy issues like, do national postal systems exist in the future? And if they do, what do they do? And what's the balance between a publicly owned postal system and private parcel carriers? So, we put these things in there for a reason, not just to entertain or drive the plot forward. We put them in there to pose these tough questions.
So just as a little bit of context, the publication that you can find on the Shared Use Mobility website, we had the pleasure of revisiting, making some small tweaks to that, and republishing it with Benjie and his team. The initial work was done for the Mindaroo Foundation in Australia as part of their Future Says initiative, where they're really interested in rethinking mobility of people and goods, particularly in Perth in Western Australia. So we have to say thanks to them too, because they supported this initial work. And then maybe just as a closing thought, to share a little bit about why, if we're ultimately interested in the policy, business, and let's say design shifts that Anthony mentioned in those big questions, why didn't we just make a white paper, right? And so one of the things that Anthony and I have been exploring in this project and a number of others previously related to AVs or kind of general urban technology questions is the way in which we can use futures to both make things that are concrete in the way that a product vision is, but also address large-scale structural and systemic questions in the way that white papers are often very good at. And so we're trying to find a way to touch both ends of those scales to make something that really brings to life a story of social, economic, and technical change. And I think that's it, Anthony, unless you have any final comments.
No, I think let's open it up and hear from Imogen and our audience. Am I the only one that can't hear Benjie?
Sorry, I was on mute. I said, let me welcome back my panel and thank you for that presentation, and we'll dive into the discussion. Let me first welcome Imogen joining us and have her say hello to our small audience. And then I'm going to turn the first question to you, Imogen.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you very much for letting me join the panel, and I hope I have something valuable to say. We'll find out in time. Absolutely.
And for the audience, if you have a question, use the Q&A function so that we can then track the questions. And I've seen that questions are already coming up. You can also use the chat function to just say hello to everyone and introduce yourself. We're a small crowd today. So Imogen, you're the only panelist we have, and these two guys have come up with the scenarios, looked at the signals. What stuck out for you? What struck you about these scenarios?
Well, I suppose a couple of things really, and I think that last slide really summarized it really well. In that, these are not prescribed versions of the future. They're not, let's look into our crystal ball and see what happens. But rather, they're sort of looking at the implication of converging trends that we're seeing at the moment and trying to see what combination of political, social, environmental factors are the things that are going to make them snowball. And that's interesting because what you see in all of these scenarios is that there's, big emphasis on distribution and decentralization, big emphasis on the way that actually having super localized systems that are super tailored to the community that they're serving actually depend on reducing distances. They depend on other things like local manufacture, and actually start to really address the role that transportation, and I mean that in terms of kind of mobility of people and of things, can play in undoing some of the injustices that we see within our current systems. But the other thing that the scenarios don't shy away from is how these systems can start with really, really good intentions and somehow evolve into something which represents or seems a little bit more Amazon-like. And I think that emphasizes why, exploring futures is so important, because then you have to think about the mechanisms that you need to put in place to create that version of the future that you actually want to see. So yeah, those were kind of my main takeouts, I think.
Just to follow up on that one, this space. Are you seeing the same signals that that Bryan and Anthony are seeing in what's happening in delivery and robotics and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at kind of the gig economy, which initially looks really, really positive, and you can be your own boss and you can work the hours that you like, and then you think actually it can be really exploitative. And so how can you sort of restore some of that ownership to your employers, and how can you sort of not necessarily be completely dependent on enormous layers of middlemen or kind of big platform companies. I think, also over the past kind of year, looking at how our systems need to be really, really resilient, and they need to kind of support typically underserved communities as well. But within that frame as well is that looking at, well, these big, enormous platform companies have convenience as king and profit as king. But that's not to say that's the only route to achieve it. And I think through having these sort of slightly different motivations, it forces everyone to have a very different approach to creating profitable systems that can support, people that typically have been left out from the systems that exist today.
So let me Anthony and Bryan, you told us at the start of what prompted you to work on these scenarios and what were the signals you were seeing. But and Imogen has already been telling us how these scenarios are useful, right? But for those of us who are new to scenarios, tell us, right? You said we didn't do a white paper and we didn't do a product kind of vision. How do regular people, right, use scenarios like this and say, how does that help us shape the future? Or are they, what do this, and why are they stories? So maybe a much more basic question for you guys.
Bryan, you want to go first, or?
Go for it.
Okay, so for me, it was, there's a bit of assembling these sort of weak signals that we were seeing in a very fast-moving landscape, particularly last spring when there were a lot of other more urgent priorities. We had a pandemic, we had an uprising, we had the hottest summer ever. And knowing that, like, sort of left to its own mores, this probably is going to end up in a pretty consolidated, corporate, globally kind of organized thing. And that's now happening faster because the pandemic sort of sped up the timetable. So it was a bit of pulling the evidence together, doing it in a way that was accessible, not just for policy wonks, not just for product people, for lay people, really. Doing it in a bit of a sensational way, although I think like everything that we put together was plausible and internally consistent. But it's really to give people very clear, stark images of both really good and really bad. And then, I was really happy to hear Imogen saw this, like the messiness of that sometimes you try to do something good, like reinvent your postal system in the last scenario. And then we have a scene at the end of that plays out where the Australian National Guard goes and seizes like pharmaceuticals from every pharmacy in the country because the state has that awareness of what's in the supply chain. And that turns out to make people very unhappy. So, it's like building powerful tools for good can often put power in the hands of people that want to do bad things as well. And so we really wanted to play that complexity out in ways that people could understand.
Bryan, did you want to add something to that? Because I have another question for you specifically.
No, I think that's good.
So the two-part question, right? One is that you guys wrote this when the pandemic was starting up, right? Middle of 2020. So the easy question is, so what has changed signal-wise? Have some been strengthened? And you're like, oh yeah, it's even closer to the dystopian or utopian future that you guys are imagining. And some may have weakened. So what are those particular signals? And then following up to that, because we've kind of all mentioned it, right? This threat of the monopolization, not even a threat because it's starting to happen, right? And the scary thing about the Postify scenario for me was that first line of the last delivery of the post system was this umbrella to Arizona, and you're like, oh, you want the postal system to go away? That's pretty scary, given the context of the last 2 years where there seemed to be a very overt move to weaken the national postal system here in the US. So kind of complex question. Signals, threat of monopoly, and isn't that kind of a little scary, both on the side of slicing up this new supply chain?
To set the record straight, we don't want the post office to go away.
Okay.
But I think to Anthony's point, an important way in which the scenario development differs from a product vision is that we accept that the world is not all sunshine and rainbows, right? And so that was written at a moment where there was a almost existential crisis for the post office here in the States. And so we kind of leaned into that as a way to think about, well, if that disaster were to play out here, what could it set in motion, right? And this is one of the benefits of working at the scale of stories that are set in Brooklyn, Eindhoven, and Perth is that we can imagine America is the canary in the coal mine that shocks somebody like Australia to be more proactive in rethinking its postal service for this century. In terms of the monopoly question, I think one thing that I expected to see a year ago or maybe more 2 years ago that has not played out as anticipated is just the pace of acquisitions and mergers in the local delivery space. I think that if we weren't in COVID times, that would have been much more frothy in the way that it had been previously in the AV space. And so in a funny way, that's kind of held back maybe the monopolization. I think I'm also a little bit surprised that some of the one-off experiments. So for instance, here in Southeast Michigan, in Ann Arbor, we have Refraction AI, who are a delivery bot company. And you see those bots every now and then in the same way that you would occasionally see Postmates bots in San Francisco or something like that before the pandemic. So it seems like maybe the pace of change has been a little bit flat. But other big things, we were talking before the webinar started that there's no discussion of Web3 or the decentralized web. There's no discussion of the financial side of that. And I think that if we had sat down today and written these scenarios, that would be certainly part of the discussion. I also feel like one of the things that I am missing, and this might just be because my attention has gone a little bit elsewhere since the project. I'm a little bit in the weeds currently trying to launch a new degree program. But I think the groundswell of co-op and community activity that Anthony and I were really excited about at the very beginning of the pandemic lockdown last year seems to have dried up or heavily slowed because things opened back up. And so, this is one of those examples where for better or for worse, mostly for worse, that crisis really created an opportunity at huge expense, obviously, but for this narrow slice of the world did something quite interesting. And as those pressures shifted or evaporated, then things have kind of relaxed back into the prior status quo, in my opinion. So I'm really hungry to see how we can bring back some of that community and co-op spirit to this sector.
Yeah, if I could just build on
Go ahead, Anthony.
That last thing that Bryan said. I think at least in the US, the effectiveness of the pandemic relief, the economic relief, in keeping people out of dire poverty is something that may have sapped energy from some of that mutual aid and cooperative, that there was, a cushion of direct cash aid that is well documented now to have succeeded in averting the worst of kind of household economic collapse. And so, and then part of it's just exhaustion. On my block, I participate in a community refrigerator, and the family that hosts it is just completely exhausted and they want to shut it down. Constant stream. There's a lot of sort of like invisible labor that goes on around those projects that I think people are willing and able to step into, but it needs to be sustainable. The thing that has surprised me that's really positive in this space is that the sort of speed and effectiveness of the municipal pushback on the really egregious kind of heavy-handed delivery fees that some of the platforms were charging small businesses. My mayor here in Jersey City put a cap on those fees, I think at 10%, which was a reduction from 30%, and a lot of other municipalities have done that too. And I think the industry responded and realized that this was in the long run, kind of their version of Uber's grayballing. It was going to create a permanent sense of ill will between them and the people who are regulating them. And I think they stepped back from it. And then the big open question for me is going forward, how the opportunity for automation sort of plays in with the changing labor markets. Compensation for a lot of these folks has risen because the market is super tight, which you would think would create a lot of drive for automation, but it's also making, these are no longer, David Graeber's kind of jobs. These are better jobs. Hours are better, working conditions are better, and pay is better. And that is something that's probably going to get locked in. So I'll be curious to see how that plays in with and then you see the unionization drive happening in the core of the supply chain in Amazon. It's possible that that's where the momentum from some of this cooperative stuff has gone into a more traditional kind of rebalancing between labor and capital. So I think it's all positive, but really volatile right now.
Imogen, did you want to add something to that? And then I'm going to ask about the institutional setups.
Well, I think I completely agree with the comments that Anthony made, that, we can have altruism as our sort of ultimate motivator, but at the end of the day, if Amazon is more convenient and cheaper, that's what we're going to defer to. And, I write frequently about transportation equity and sort of, empowering various different people. And then I still get Amazon deliveries and I feel guilty about it every time, but it is the easier option. And I think as soon as that option sort of comes back and presents itself as a sort of viable option, it removes the sort of requirement to really make these distributed, decentralized, community-driven, solutions work financially, logistically, and for sort of the greater good as well. I think the other thing that I was just really interested in, that was mentioned in the scenarios as well, was how actually what's the form factor of the services that then dictates how our physical landscape changes around it. And in one of the scenarios that mentions curb cuts for robots, which I thought was really, really fascinating, and who gets priority in this situation, and are we sort of completely people-centric first, or are we delivery-centric first in whatever format that takes?
I mean, yeah, with all the complaints of kick scooters, right, blocking sidewalks or bikes, what happens when we have a host of robots I'm part of a advisory group for Southern California's kind of planning, Southern California area governments for future of kind of autonomous and electric vehicles. One of the things that a local advocate said was maybe if they have sidewalk robots, they'll start fixing our sidewalks because they need to be smooth for the robots. Let me jump into kind of, it's scenario of probable utopia, dystopia, but it's not quite clear that way because it's a spectrum and all of these unintended consequences. Question open to all three of you. What are the what are the institutional shifts that are happening now that are invisible to us? And maybe I'm looking to Bryan to this, right? That we see the little tiny robots being demonstrated and we hear the talk about the autonomous trucks, right, that are delivering in between. And famously, Anthony wrote in his book that the autonomous car is a red herring. It's all these robots that are actually being out there. What are we not seeing in terms of the organization, which Anthony mentioned about the unionization kind of counteracting this monopolization? How is that labor supply chain or institutional supply chain shifting? Or are all these robot delivery companies that have started out, are they all just waiting to sell out to Amazon or Alibaba or whoever it is that dominates the full supply chain?
I mean, I'll take a quick crack at that. One thing that I think is super institutional and is kind of silent right now is what is the federal government's vision for the future of logistics and the supply chain? I mean, you pointed out in the beginning that basically like the circulatory system for it's really North American economy is completely dysfunctional right now. Yet we know that long haul trucking is probably the single clearest viable use case right now for automated driving. So where is the federal policy to expedite that, to deal with this huge labor shortage that's only going to get worse? I mean, we're at a point now where there's national security implications to it. Like the US could not go to war right now if it had to. And I think everybody in the national security community knows that. But like, we're not doing anything about it because our ports are congested and our trucking system doesn't have enough people to work it. And so, it's not just like a vision even, but like, what's the emergency crisis management plan for it? And I think automation has to be a huge part of it. And there's an opportunity to create a whole new industry and to harvest some of the fruits of all the money that's gone into automated driving so far. So that's a big missing piece we need to move forward. So call up Mayor Pete and tell him you want a automated trucking policy.
From an institutional standpoint, one of the things we try to do with the scenarios was also find the unexpected opportunities for particularly municipalities to have power in this equation, right? So a lot of what's happening in AVs here in the US is above the cities because it's federally controlled. And so, for instance, the curb cuts that Imogen pointed out were an example of where we were like, really, how would a city fight back against, for instance, a flood of delivery bots taking over sidewalks? So, of course, you can ban ban robots on your sidewalks, like some places have done, including Toronto just started talking about it yesterday. But that then cuts off the economic opportunity there and also the emergency preparedness that Anthony mentioned. So I think actually there's some really interesting design questions here that perhaps are not institutional in the way that you were asking, Benjie, but for instance, just the basic architectural issue of how robots get in and out of a building with presumably a greater frequency than people. And those robots are crossing a sidewalk in a perpendicular fashion if they're going to get to the street, or they're running down the sidewalk with all of the problems that we have of our sidewalks. Detroit is not a great place to run things on sidewalks if there are sidewalks in your neighborhood. And so I think that creates the assumptions right now that we see from industry don't really match up with the reality just from a physical infrastructural standpoint. And then to achieve that sets up demands on our institutions that I don't think we're quite ready to commit to, because as Anthony said, we haven't really had a conversation about delivery and mobility in a coherent way. We're still in the mode of trying to jam computer controlled cars onto streets that were designed for horses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, having with my sort of old arrival hat on, so often you can be in these sort of tech companies, you're like, this is the coolest thing, everyone will love this. And you're like, hang on, we need to think about every single person in this entire equation. Like, what does that ecosystem look like? And ultimately, how is a sort of municipal government going to cope with this and sort of respond to it? And I think the more that we can kind of have those conversations around, how do we consider the complete ecosystem and appreciate the different timescales that different people within that ecosystem move on, then we can have much more sensible discussions rather than sort of crowbarring in stuff because it's cool and just because we can. And then, yeah, maybe they'll be a little bit more helpful as well.
And, I think this is something that isn't so present in the 3 stories that we're talking about today, but in some prior work Anthony and I did, imagining how local deliveries actually play out in urban environments. This point you're bringing up, Imogen, became a real source of opportunity. So the dream that a robot is going to bring you your salad or your burrito or whatever means that you need to be there promptly to retrieve that item. And none of us are prompt for anything. So just to make something like that actually play out in a congested city means that there's probably a role on the other side, the receiving end. And that becomes a really interesting question to think about from an economic opportunity standpoint. What's the nature of that role? Who's paying for their labor? Is it one person or lots of people? And those become, I think, really generative design questions, but it only emerges if you think about the whole service as a service, not just as the shiny product.
So I'm gonna jump on and make one point, right? I'm racking my brains figuring out, the DOT at the local level, the DOTs are concerned about streets, to some extent, sidewalks for people. But in the same way that when bike share started coming around, the DOTs suddenly had to start spinning up teams concerned with micromobility or sharing. There are no teams about delivery. In fact, when I was in the US Seattle DOT, all of this vertical integration of delivery data, where you order something on Amazon or e-commerce, and when it's going to be delivered, and you now get a picture of, oh, it's on your doorstep. That was completely invisible to the departments of transportation, data-wise, and they're not even asking for it. And it's the fastest growing sector of moving vehicles, right? Because we're moving more of that stuff. So there is a question of institutionally who's supposed to be responsible for robots on the sidewalk or robot deliveries. The other that I'll leave with this question, and then we're going to turn over to Q&A with our audience, right? Is like, what can we learn for shared mobility for humans that we can learn from the scenarios and how this is shaping up? You mentioned horses, right? Roads made for horses. Well, there was a time that there was no separation between that thing carries people and that thing carries goods. And in your scenario, in the Postify, it was like, oh, I'm walking over there. I get to pick up something and drop it off at that person's place, and therefore I get some sort of credit for it. What can shared mobility of humans learn, or maybe how will it all meld in the scenarios you're playing out and what you're seeing happening with the whole supply chain of delivery of parcels and goods?
So sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Imogen.
My personal belief is that I find it really weird that we still think about movement of goods and movement of people as 2 separate things. And it's not like they're happening in parallel universes. They're occupying the same streets, sharing the same roads. And so surely there has to be a space for those 2 spheres to combine. And, a really simple example, say, is that, drones use a lot of energy when they're flying in the sky. But actually, could they do part of their journeys planted on the roof of buses? And could they use the bus stop network as like places to sort of recharge? And how can you make those 2 spheres collide and actually appreciate that when people move, they are also moving things with themselves as well? And I just think that, maybe this is like the complete, and Benjie, I know that we spoke about this on Monday, but maybe this is the complete techno-optimist, techno-solutionist view of the world. But there's so much insight to gather and so much kind of human behavior insight to gather on combining those 2 spheres that I think we have to kind of start thinking of them as one rather than 2 discrete channels.
All right, I'm going to jump into the questions from our audience. Richard asks, there are cooperatives like NYC's The Drivers Cooperative that have adopted the cooperative model to provide a driver-owned alternative to the Uber-Lyft model. What are some scenarios where autonomous mobility be adopted by these types of co-ops? I think you have sort of a line in the Postify one, which like robots work if they're owned by the community. But what are these types of co-ops putting them out there to work?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this one. I think the transition to full automation, let's just say it takes 20, 30 years. At the end of that transition, there's still going to be a lot of human work left in the system. It will be a different set of jobs. It might be fewer jobs. It'll probably be a lot more skilled. It may not be in the same locations it is now. But in that interim, there's going to be a lot of roles for humans to play, and they're going to be changing. So, you know, one that we heard about already was teleoperation. So essentially the drone pilots, when, as with many of the automated delivery vehicles now, it's not so much driving itself autonomously as it is navigating between a set of waypoints that an operator clicks on a map and then kind of monitors. So you might have one drone pilot driving 10 vehicles. The problem with that is that that stuff's going to get consolidated, probably globally, at least within like time zones. So like KiwiBot now, that function happens in Bogota because one of the founders is Colombian, and they're able to get skilled young people for a lot less money there. And it's the same thing doing it there as it is doing it in California. And then another function, which is, so like that's interesting because there'll be more jobs, they'll be the same, if not more jobs in different places, potentially more skilled, etc. Then there's this set of like people training the AI that's going to replace them. And I just had a conversation yesterday with a group of students who are thinking about how to use dash cam footage to do what you were talking about, Benjie, which is help cities understand where the goods are moving because they know nothing about it. So they want to be able to, pick out boxes and delivery vans and people schlepping stuff down the sidewalk just from the dash cam footage and push that intelligence back to whoever wants it. And they want to also use drivers to tag the different events, kind of like Waze. So I said to them, like, well, how are you going to compensate people to train the AI that's going to put them out of a job? And so I'm going to let them think about that for a few months. But I think there is a lot of work in an automated logistics system. It's just different kind of work, and it's in different places.
All right, here's another question from Manali. There's a huge gap globally in the technology, efficiencies, and operations of delivery systems. For example, in the Bay Area, you can have long lines of trucks at port waiting to get loaded, and in the same region, you will see robots on the sidewalks delivering pizza. What is the most promising low-tech solution of the future, and what is the most promising high-tech solution of the future? So just bracketing us here, right? So low-tech, what's the most promising thing? High-tech, what's the most promising thing?
Walking. It's the most low-tech you can get.
Right.
Yes.
Or wheelchairing if that's what you need to do as well. But in both of those scenarios, at the port, you've got goods coming from all over the world. With the pizza scenario, it's coming from maybe a mile away, maybe a couple miles away. And so it's a question of distance. And if you can make that distance either kind of physically or, the time is shorter, then that's where you can use as low-tech solutions as possible. And so I wonder when we talk about, co-ops and sort of, highly localized and decentralized sort of delivery systems, that actually you need to look at, well, what is being delivered within that system and where is it being made? So, we get food from all over the world. How could we use, vertical farming and sort of localized farming to kind of plug that need and to create much more robust ecosystems around what's being delivered as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, walking, that's the 100% the most low-tech solution that you can get. On the flip side, I think, the amount of kind of freight tech that we're seeing is a really cool space to look at, and especially seeing how blockchain's being integrated into that as well. And to be honest, I think autonomous HGVs is where we're going to see the first deployment of autonomous vehicles. There, I'm sure Anthony may have a different view, but that's probably the high tech end of the spectrum.
I've got a proposal for the low tech, and just looking at the whole supply chain, right? It's like in the high end, you've got the standard container van TEU units, which I hear the cost of a container van buying it went from $4,000 to now $40,000 because of the problems in the supply chain and turning those things around. But is there like they call it the 20-foot equivalent unit, right? The particular size. Is there kind of a maybe we can develop a very small TEU, and that could be part of the circular economy, right? Why do the boxes come in different sizes, and they're all, and then you're stuck with a whole pile of boxes that you're going to have to. There are free box local Facebook groups, right? If you're moving and you look for them, is there something like that, kind of let's standardize the size, the way the vacuum tube was a standard thing when in buildings when we were doing mail by vacuum tubes. All right, Manali has two other questions, but here's one. Do you think bike share companies should be involved in delivery systems? And how would it? You know, they obviously have pivoted to food deliveries in some cases, right? I think is it Lyft or Uber that, or one of the food delivery companies, that if you're using an e-bike, you get more points as a delivery person or a higher rate. But how would those two now?
I mean,
I think this is.
Go ahead, Brian.
I think this is an area where it actually connects back to your prior question, Benjie, about the overlap between mobility of people and goods. So I know, Benjie, you and I have chatted about the shared use mobility hubs, right? What are the intersections of a 21st century city that perform maybe the role that rail stations did in a prior generation? Not that rail stations won't exist, but we probably end up with some kind of new place in cities, which is where you are able to get a ride and also get your stuff, right? Particularly if the receiving in logistics, the security questions and porch pirates and all that kind of stuff continue in the way that they have here in the US at least. So I think that the cycling question, like none of these questions really hang on their own, right? You can't rethink deliveries without rethinking human mobility and vice versa. And I would include micromobility as part of that. And I think that's part of what drove us to think about the scenarios again, is really to bring to life a world where all of these little bits have added up to a larger alternative. Whereas because we're living through these transitions as individuals right now, we're seeing only shards of any particular future. And they perhaps are dissatisfying as individual pieces, but can be really compelling when they start to scaffold onto each other in a mutually kind of coherent system.
Anthony, you're gonna.
Yeah, I think there's a very, very tiny number of cargo bike share setups operating. I think Oakland has one. I think there's one in Berlin. Seeing either subsidies or pilots, to add some cargo carrying, vehicles to those bike share networks and see what the uptake is, I think would be really positive.
So I'm gonna wrap us up, and I leave one question for all of you to answer, right? And so the kind of, not even a threat, but the overwhelming monopolization of the space is starting to happen. And it could be more inclusive if we engage those particular companies. But if you were going to imagine an organization or advocacy group or institution beyond the local co-ops that would say, we need to call attention to this space and how it's either propagating more inequities or get, slice behind the whole fancy, shiny robots to say what is really happening. How would you imagine that organization to be? What would its main cost be? Where would it be? Is it a convening of the UN on something, or is it like a whole bunch of USPS alumni or gig workers, right? What would that be? And so that's more speculative, but to me, it points to kind of like, where is the spear point in this? Right? And I'll ask each of you to respond.
I will make one quick comment, is that I see a lot of policy agitation coming out of municipalities, big cities in the US, about sort of the right to delivery, and the fact that there's a lot of parts of cities where people are isolated now. Food deserts, working from home, they're not working, they have childcare responsibilities, single moms, those kinds of things, and they can't securely receive deliveries at their residences, and that is becoming, the way I hear people talk about it, it's almost like the way they talked about broadband 10 years ago, that this is sort of like a new service that really needs to be universal and reliable and secure in order for everyone to participate in the economy and in education as well, and healthcare. So I think that's really interesting, and it seems to be coming from a sort of group of smart cities, that keep track of this stuff and are going to put some energy into making policy.
Bryan, and then I'll wrap up with Imogen.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, I was going to go in the same direction. So, I think the opportunity here is to prototype the future that we want to see, and we can do that right now with cargo bikes and walking and technologies that are already in hand, and think about then how those might be accelerated or new alternatives might be added when robotic delivery, autonomous delivery becomes more prevalent. But I don't think there's anything stopping, say, a downtown core business improvement district, or perhaps an anchor institution like a hospital or a university, thinking about how they create their own local logistics system, and how they do it in a manner that's intentionally thinking about the carbon footprint, the labor implications, the range of choice in terms of pace and packaging, and all the other details that we've talked about here. Somebody has to be the one that takes a stab at actually building a service around those ideas. And if we can make that happen, even in the most low-tech way, I think it will show the possibility of an alternative mode or alternative way of thinking about deliveries that then will create new business opportunities and new revenue models within it that would be really exciting.
Yeah, and I think I'd build again on the previous comments in that, each city or each kind of industry that exists within a city is so unique. It has its own particular character, culture, sort of nuances, etc. And so there is an element that we need to just kind of have these pockets of innovation and see how they kind of work out and what kind of other things they sort of simulate as well. I also think because of that, it's much more a case of we need to provide the tools and see how they're used and how they're used. I think the example of throwing in cargo bikes into bike share is a really, really great example of that. That said, I think we also need private organizations to understand what the metrics of success are. And it can't just be about as quick delivery for the lowest cost possible. There needs to be ways to see that supporting the underserved communities or whoever's kind of been left out of the system that exists is actually rewarded, and that those incentives exist beyond just being a nice person.
And in that note, just I said that was my last question, but I've got one more question, right? Just to lead to the audience, like, if we were going to follow anyone on Twitter or on Medium or wherever, who would you recommend, apart from the three of you, that people pay attention to in terms of thinking and innovation in this space, or in the space that, and I'll set it free to say, you can jump off and say, doesn't matter, this person that is thinking about technology and robotics and everything, go at least pay attention to them. They may not be always right on things, but you pay attention to them. Who would you recommend, or one or two or more that you would recommend to the audience?
So one that's not particularly imaginative, but I think they're just, so far, they're a fantastic company, is Via. They recently, I think, raised another 130 million, but what they're doing, they're plugging holes in public transit and making that a profitable service. And I think that is really, really cool. And we need more companies like that. From a kind of urbanist futurist point of view, I'm sure many people are familiar with Dan Hill, but I I love reading what he has to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those probably be my two. I'm sure I'll think of more as we hang up.
Thank you. Bryan and Anthony?
Well, I would echo Imogen's suggestions, and then I find myself actually really gravitating towards some of the legal questions here, because I feel like we're going to get momentum, and then there's going to be some we're going to get blindsided by some aspect of the legality of these services. So I'm following people like Rebecca Williams here in the US, who are kind of thinking broadly about legal implications, and then other designers. So for instance, people like Chelsea Malden at Public Policy Lab, who are really asking or almost demanding that we take seriously the kind of equity and labor dimensions from the start of these kinds of projects.
Anthony?
Yeah, so I will also endorse VIA. I just this week have a student who's being recruited very, very actively by both Google and VIA. And I, of course, made the case for, joining a startup that's trying to help cities rather than extract value from them. As far as like following, I think a big influence on this project was Trevor Scholz's work at the New School and the platform cooperatives movement, which has, moved in fits and starts, but has really, I think, created the most interesting community of radical thinkers around what alternatives to global, global computation dominated by a handful of firms might look like. It's still a work in progress, but it's definitely a rich vein to mine.
I like that, the platform cooperatives idea, right? That versus the kind of platform companies that everyone seems to be wanting to become a platform company to dominate the space. Full disclosure, we have two members of the board, one member of the board who is with VIA, and another member of the board is with Amazon. But this conversation was not influenced by either. Let's wrap up. We're a little 5 minutes early, but this was a really, really great conversation. I think for me, the reason we brought this forward was to really talk about what is actually really happening really, really fast in robotics. And as I go back to what Anthony wrote in his book, it's like we keep talking about the autonomous car, which for us in the shared mobility space is saying that's not going to solve anything. The way electric vehicle is not really going to solve anything by itself. And we need to get to more shared mobility and shift the autocentricity. And at the same time, kind of this distributed delivery that's happening with kind of the consolidation that is also happening on the money side of this. And what does that mean for equity? And what does that mean for our ability to address the climate crisis? And with that, join me, my participants and audience, with thanking our panelists, thanking Anthony and Bryan for their thought-provoking scenarios. As always, I take away with it this excitement of what new jobs are going to be there and what kind of institutions and organizations are going to come out, apart from being irritated at the little fancy robots that are going around. And thank you so much, Imogen, for joining us and bringing in your knowledge of what really matters in this space and who's paying attention. And I hope this is the first of many more conversations. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for the small audience that joined us. We are recording this and we will make it available. And I think we'll also have some of a transcript. So thank you so much, panelists. And thank you so much to my colleagues in the Shared Use Mobility Center for helping me put this together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.